There might be no greater feeling of awe in Elden Ring than descending to the Eternal Cities for the first time. The journey from ancient ruins with claymen, through winding caves with carnivorous ants, culminating in a boss fight against a dragonkin soldier as a giantess perched on a chair watches. It's filled with symbolism and presents us with a lot more questions than answers. The giantess, long dead, sitting on the Chair Crypt, towers over the player as they fight the dragonkin soldier. Who is she? Fellas looking like bloodborne bath messengers painfully look to the giantess perched on a throne, a few of them clutching their ears and staring at the ground. This is not the only giantess or giant skeleton in the lands between by any means, but she carries design elements from the Nox clergy, and can give us an indication as to why she's on top of a crypt. To start, I want to talk about the caves leading up to her, and some of the IRL influences on how we should read the Nox and their environment. Because the giantess is meant to be a centerpiece in the underground areas, we can get a little more info on her when we take a moment to understand the environment she lives in. The fake night sky in two of the Eternal Cities takes inspiration from the Waitomo Caves in New Zealand. There are a few more caves, like the Ryukari, but the most famous is the Waitomo. These caves are famous for the glowworms that dot the walls with their bioluminescent light. They are karst caves, which have winding waterways, very similar to the waterways you walk through in game. The Waitomo Caves were first explored in 1887. I believe the Maori knew of their existence, but as far as we know, they hadn't really explored the caves. It's important to note caves and glowworms both have significance in Maori cosmology. We see the inspiration of the caves and glowworms not only in the night sky, but in some of the other bioluminescent assets. The glowworm, famous for its bright mucus strands, even influenced the nature of the Nox. If you go into the Eternal Cities, you'll find trap after trap after trap. Like a glowworm trapping a bug in its shiny strands, so too do the Nox use their mimics to trap the tarnished in sticky situations. The strands of spheres that decorate their metal work are obvious callbacks to glowworms, but also pearl motifs. This is on top of caves being burial grounds and entry points to the underworld for the Maori. This is important because, as so many other loreheads and Elden Ring enthusiasts have talked about in length, the underground areas have much underworld influence from other cultures and their own cosmologies. I won't get into those ones. But they all really combine to give us this idea that when you're going underground, you're not only just going beneath the ground, but you're also going into a new world, and you're going into the underworld and somewhere where maybe the rules are maybe slightly different. I'm not an architectural gal, but from my very basic research, the architectural style of the Nox seems to be made as a sort of precursor to Raya Lucaria's. I imagine to show the connection between the two. But it does also remind me a lot of some Italian architecture that I've seen. I believe that's Gothic. But to me, the Nox buildings are more reminiscent of the Romanesque style, but with a little Gothic thrown in there. Also, it's just cool. While Raya Lucaria is completely in the Gothic style, judging from the vaulting ribs and the structure shapes, we could say it's a little different for the Nox. But of course, it's important to note that Romanesque style leads into Gothic architecture, which gives us a lot of interim buildings in both of those styles to look at in life. What we can talk about besides that is some of the repeating elements in the buildings that give us a little more insight later. Notice that the Chair Crypts are a stone material rather than that dark metal. This dark metal is all over the Eternal Cities, and maybe likely due to the Black Moon. But the Black Moon is obsidian rock, and that was shattered a long time ago. But the Black Moon seems like another attempt by the Nox to subvert the world order, since we know that moons can affect the fate of demigods and the stars. We've touched on the glowworms influencing the Nox in the way they trap people, and that it's influenced their art. These chains with the spheres all over are a callback to not only the mimics, but also the glowworms. And I wonder if it's also a slight reference to pearls or eggs, but there's just a lot of spheres in this game. Regardless, we can see that the Nox not only change the environment around them, like the dam, but they're also influenced by that environment, which is really cool. Symbolically, the Nox are meant to be seen influencing things all over the lands between, and their motifs show that. Let's move on to the most important feature underground to the Giantess, which is the Chair Crypt. As important as her clothes, the chair she sits on is specifically called a crypt, as shown by the Chair Crypt of Grace. Crypts were created as a way to house religious and important people, along with religious and important stuff. They arrived during the early Christian period, so Constantine era, and were first seen in Africa and Constantinople. They were precursors like the Mithraeum, which was like a cave burial, and then of course there were catacombs, which if you've played this game, you know what those are, if you've really played any of the From Software games. Crypts are noted to be usually underground, but are also sometimes called mausoleums when above ground. This history supports a lot of what the Giantess's fashion can tell us as well. As we'll focus on today, her outfit is meant to be religious, but the inclusion of these chairs being crypts connects the clothes, and the Nox clergy in general, to death rites. We see this further in overlapping design elements from the mausoleums and the chair crypts. One of the ways we can immediately tie the two together are the skulls and skeletons that are around them. Both have the exaggerated blood-borne mouth open, agape. We see that in the similar architecture to denote them as Nox as well, and most importantly, they're attached to how we take care of the dead. I believe that the Nox were influenced by discovering ancient history underground, and that probably influenced their death rites. One of the things I noticed that mirrors the imagery on the back of the chair are the images, or I guess the front of the chair, the top half, are the images here in manuscript showing papers being flung from a central point. While definitely I have seen Tarnished Archaeologist's video, and he makes a really compelling and convincing argument that it is a bug motif, I just thought the similarities were striking enough to at least show y'all. And also because this is so heavy on the Christian kind of symbolism, especially in this game, it's just important to note. And that brings us to our next part. Biblical figures and deities are often depicted larger than their counterparts in numerous depictions of art across centuries of work. We're talking manuscripts, psalters, reliefs, and statues, all playing with size to indicate importance and relation to a higher power. For more information on the subject, I definitely suggest popping into a Quayleg stream or video and talking to them about it. They know their art history. One often portrayed in these works is the Virgin Mother and Child. So one of the famous images is the gift of the Magi. You'll see three wise men giving gifts to the Madonna and Child. There's many depictions of the Virgin that show her on a much larger scale compared to the people in the scene around her. The Virgin Mother is often tied to birth, crescent moons, and purity. With the Nox's propensity for subverting common life cycles for the inhabitants of the lands between, it would be no surprise the developers would possibly utilize this imagery as inspiration. While the Virgin Mother is a common figure seen sitting large in scale to the people around her, we do see this also being done with other religious figures. Even so, we can still grasp at the very least there is some ceremony-like thing going on, and they are essential to a special practice of the Nox. With the existence of the towering Albinarch Archer receiving a birthing droplet via the Lieutenant quest in-game, I wonder if we have come upon the Giantess post-ceremony, a Madonna without her child. Granted, that's all conjecture, so let's get into the fashion. The clothes of the giantess are inherently ecclesiastical, even more so than her monastic counterparts. They need to fight. She doesn't. She's sitting and dead. There are, however, some oddities we will cover later. The uniqueness of construction alludes to a specific role being appointed, either to make this person the size that they are, or possibly chosen because of their size. The golden, yellowish colors could be alluding to this occurrence during the Nox's proximity to Lendau, pre-banishment rituals now done underground, or towards a use of gold, pre-Marika. Her sleeves are long, just like her fellow Nox ladies, but this also matches with long sleeves simply being a common style in the lands between. The design on the front chest area has striking similarities to the design on the Chair Crypt itself. The top half looks separate, almost like a really short crop top. I haven't found an exact in relief counterpart for it, but it does need to be said that this matches the layering the clergy is with their chest armor pieces. So the armor pieces that the Nox do have this kind of like separate top part. So maybe it's a little bit of a combination of that. While the giantess lacks the hennin worn by her Swartstress and Maiden sisters, she too is covering all of her hair with a similar technique underneath. Finding an exact in real life inspiration is difficult because of how common hoods are, and to be honest, I don't think we're going to get much more information than what we already know. And that head coverings across history were used to promote purity, religious devotion, and were used across many cultures. In game, this places her visually close to the rest of the Nox clergy, but closer to the other maidens in the lands between. One of the similar items is the Traveling Maiden's hood. We again find similarity to this statue that is also very closely tied to death and has visual textile elements similar to Lusat and Azur's robes. These connections are even more prevalent when we consider the Chair Crypt of Celia houses the Lusat staff. This makes sense considering how burial practices transform over time. So this piece of fabric confounds me. Why is it here? It definitely doesn't connect to the Nox clergy, nor does it match the Nox statues. The textile design matches the lining fabric elsewhere on the giantess, but I haven't found this textile elsewhere yet. This piece could be a scapular, another priestly vestment, but scapulars are usually worn from the top of the chest and down. There are priestly aprons called gramules, but again, usually rectangular. It could be a maniple, but maniples are not usually on the apron, they're usually on the arm. While the design is different, it is reminiscent of the apron, let's call it the apron, on the statue design all over Liurnia and on top of various coffins and this is important, and I'll provide more thoughts at the end regarding this. The skirt she's wearing is very shredded. We can see, however, that the skirt is not cut evenly around the hem and rises up. At first I thought the raised skirt parts were out of the ribbing, but the embroidery indicates to us that it's cut in that odd fashion on purpose. While I am calling it a skirt, I don't know for sure if this is just a part of the top half and actually is just more of a dalmatic or an alb situation, but for now, we'll move on to the other oddity of the skirt area, which is that it might be wrapped around her. As you can see in this image, this piece of fabric possibly indicates it to be wrapped. However, it's hard to tell, and it's also very possible this is just a free piece of fabric, maybe like a pallium or a stole. But those wouldn't typically come from the back and then wrap around the legs. It's almost a subverted stole. Stoles are sometimes wrapped around the chest, but it all depends on your rank. So it's also possible that this is referencing swaddling bands that infants would use in early baptismal ceremonies. It could also even be that the wrapping is wrapped around her to force her to stay there. But we're not exactly sure yet, but we do know that it's very, very purposely placed there. And we don't see that same strip of fabric in the art. There are 3 belts worn by the giantess. One of them is a medallion belt with flowers resembling a belt on the traveler's garb. This flower is all over the game, but it's also the same flower, from what I can tell, as the ones on the mausoleum doors, and there's a few other doorways in the Eternal Cities that have the same one as well. It's right around that little... I always think of it as a deathbird kind of feather motif. The second one on top is almost bronze in its coloring. Much thicker, definitely metal, and might go into what looks like a corset. Something I'm pretty sure is not ecclesiastical is that corset. I would not be surprised, though, if this is some random historical item that I'll lament months from now for not including in the video. But we'll stay confused for right now. What we do know for sure is that the material is the same metal as the necklace, this darker sort of silver. Again, maybe Black Moon referenced? In any case, I mention it because it's still important to remember these clothes are in a fantasy world, so real-world influences can only give us so much understanding. Looking at that piece, I almost wonder if the giantess is being forced to sit here. Her neck piece is the same metal and is also similar to the gorget of the other Nox clergy. However, she is not a fighter, so maybe this piece has some religious meaning, or maybe again, it was forced on her. The cincture is a liturgical vestment worn by many a Christian denomination. You typically see them on last-minute Halloween friar costumes. They're very much tied to our idea of what a monastic, religious kind of figure should pull out. The giantess's cincture matches the Nox Maiden and Swargis's belt, except hers has the darker metal. In my last video, I theorized they were using the belt to tie the blio and monastic fashion together. And in this case, I believe it's to tie the giantess to her smaller sisters. We also see the diamondish design pressed on the belt itself. Again, maybe Black Moon related, maybe, who knows. This matches the designs on all of the Nox clergy. Something we see again, like most Nox designs, again, is this incorporation of dark metals, but contrasted by gold. So much of the Nox informs Rylacarians and Lindell, so having these two colors mixed on the giantess, and actually, now that I think about it, the Holly tree as well, it's important. The headband she is wearing is gold and almost evokes the jewelry worn by Farum Azula priests. I mention them because their designs are also influenced by burial practices, so it's possible the Nox are appropriating the style. It also reminds me of part of the medallion from the Guardian garb, which also connects to death and transformation, which I guess considering this game isn't super hard. The cuffs have similar color and design to parts of the building of various Eternal City buildings. Sorry, what does that mean? The cuffs have similar color and design to parts of the building in various parts of the Eternal Cities. We see this in a few examples all over, different metals used as decoration, as their ideas, culture, and fashion seemingly influence the lands between. It makes sense to incorporate those metals in these cuffs. It's a great design choice to incorporate design elements of the buildings around her, solidifying her not only as Nox, but a part of the physical landscape of the Eternal Cities. Whatever happened to her, she's a part of the environment now, rather than being an active participant. Before I forget, the anklets. I'm not sure why they're there. The drawing of the giantess in my collector editions art book, there's no legs, so it just might have been for fashion. But visually it makes sense. It gives her a little more design, a little decadence. Same thing for the rings. If she's being sacrificed in some way or celebrated in terms of a burial, she has to have some of the best jewelry on that a person could have in the lands between. And by the way, thank you again to Emily is the Pants. You can find her on Twitter, and she's amazing. She's hilarious, also a human. and doing fashion lore as well. She was the one who was able to free cam a lot of these photos for me today. And they really, really, really helped me. They really changed a lot of my perspectives and on the giantess. So I really, really appreciate her help. The Chair Crypts and the Giantess are some of my favorite visuals in Elden Ring. The size, the subtle design elements that relate to the environment and story, the freaky ass Bloodborne callback. The Giantess serves as an example of really smart design that uses elements elsewhere in the game to not only keep things cohesive visually, but infer timelines, cultural influences, and lore. The two giantesses we see in game remain mysterious. No matter how many times we may see one in the loading screen, their connections seem to be even a lot more present with other death rites in the game. Long sleeves are a fashion statement of Rosa's as well. The Farron priests and their medallions, the similarly shaped waistcloth to the statue that really connects to death, all the mausoleum connections. And then she's literally there on top of a chair crypt. The one thing we can surmise is that she is connected to death. I really wanted to cover the giantess in a separate part from Style Maiden because of how much there is to figure out. Unfortunately, we couldn't fit the Nox statue in, but hopefully we'll be able to cover her at another date. And now we're just gonna go into some unhinged guessing, my lore 2 cents, if you will. But thank you everybody who's been watching and supporting the Mix Files and Style Maiden videos. We will be having more. I'm hopefully going to actually be focusing also on some individual items soon. So either that'll come out first or my Fia video will come out first. One of those, we'll see. But we got a lot of things working up. There's some other stuff I've been working on. So yeah. All right, let's go into this last part. Oh, and let me add this to the thoughts as well. When it comes to her connection, I think, to the one statue with a similar apron kind of thing that she's holding, and that one also having the same design as Lusat and Azur's robes, oh my god, everything really just points to like having them really influencing Raya Lucaria. You could argue infiltrating, but I'll just say influencing. Because I think Renala at some point had to have been working tirelessly with them. At first, I had always thought that Renala like maybe had made Raya Lucaria first, but judging from like the building, I don't think so. And especially now that I think about it, the Lucaria Manor has that statue all over as well. So, it does all tie them together, and it ties a lot of like death motifs together, and I think that's really what the goal was. We have so many ways we look at death in the world and in real life, so it makes sense that like this game really kind of spends a lot of time showing how these ideas go over time. And I think with the Nox Giantess, I almost wonder if that's influenced from Farum Azula burials, and then her influencing the Nox statue woman. Because then I'm almost imagining like, well, maybe then instead of using actual bodies for your crypts, then it's like, okay, well then now we'll use a statue for our sarcophagi. That's the plural of sarcophagus. But I think we'll get more hopefully with the DLC, because I think the DLC is going to be very much death. So we'll see. I think the giantess was forced to be there. This is her burial spot. She's meant to symbolically be, to me at least, the protector of these items. Like all of the skeletons reaching out to her, and their existence elsewhere in the internal cities, they make me wonder if they were like actual Nox citizens, and over time the clergy pulled like a Bloodborne and like just like destroyed their community. And with her jewelry, like, I wouldn't be surprised if she is like maybe actually a leader and maybe has a top role. But with the existence of the towering Albinauric sister, my brain goes back to birth and her birthing something or someone, and really that's the point, right? The figure in a first playthrough needs to be open-ended. The game is always going to be delicately riding the balance of giving fans enough lore for there to be a figurable story, but enough mystery so that we have to rely on our imagination, i.e., speculating wildly. Um, so I think that's what I love the most about her, is that we really, as much as I can speculate and look into the fashion, and there's so much symbolism, there's so much subtle callbacks to other areas and buildings and motifs, and cultural, like in real life, like ways in which we bury the dead. Like there's just a lot of really cool stuff about her. Um, but we still don't really know much. We don't know a name, we don't know a title, we don't have any of that information. And I think that's a wonderful way to experience this game. All right, y'all. Well, if you want to hear more of my thoughts about this game or others, make sure you follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. And we're gonna keep writing the lore. We'll be doing hopefully some more other games too. But in the meantime, Elden Ring's taking up a lot of our time. All right, y'all. See you next time. Bye.